researchers. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Sonali Majumdar, representing the PhD Plus team and a staff member in the Office of Grad and Postdoc Affairs. Just to kind of set expectations and lay out the goals of this session, it's primarily meant to broaden the knowledge of visa options for diverse career paths in academia for this session and beyond academia for the next week's session for international PhD students and postdocs. And if you are a staff member and a faculty, this would also be really helpful for you to kind of learn to better support your international PhD students and postdocs in your departments. Today we have three panelists from the university. Adrienne Kim-Bird and Linda Callahan are representing the International Studies Office. And they support, Adrienne supports students on F1 visas, and Linda supports postdoc scholars on J1 visas. And our third panelist today is Tim White from UVA's HR's Immigration Services, who supports the H-1B visas for university and also counsels people for other long-term options. Basically, knowledge of visas for careers beyond the university that might include H-1B for-profit companies, O1, green card related questions. I recommend you attend the next session where our speaker would be attorney Mark Rhodes from McClandish Holton, where he'll talk more in details about those. In terms of what to expect for the next hour, Adrienne will serve as a moderator, and the panelists will also address the questions that you submitted when you RSVP. We got a lot of questions, so we'll cover those first. After we have covered those, there'll be as much time as we have left for open Q&A, we would address those questions. For the live Q&A, we are using another Google Doc link that you might have received today as a reminder email. Or you would also add that in the chat box in the Zoom right now where you can keep adding your questions. Just a few hints there. Please be as specific as you can while you're writing those questions right now without adding too many personal details. If we run out of time and we don't get to all of your questions today, don't worry, we'll create a resource page and share it with all participants. For any career development related questions outside of the focus of today's session, which is like visas, please follow up with E and me and schedule advising sessions for international students. The most important point that a lot of you have asked about, this session will be recorded. So please turn off your video if you prefer to have it that way. We will share the recording from the session with participants from today. And all questions, therefore, will be anonymized for your convenience. Finally, this is, as I was just saying, this is one of the most popular sessions that we've done in the past year, possibly. There's a lot of attendees in this session. So for a smooth operation, please mute yourself if you're on your computer or on your phone. With that, I'll hand it over to Adrienne to take it away from here.
Okay, thank you so much, Sonali and Yi, for organizing this webinar, and I hope it'll be helpful. Obviously, the situation is changing very rapidly. My head is spinning. It's hard to keep up. It really is, and there are a lot of unknowns, and there are a lot of questions that we simply can't answer. For example, you might have heard that there's a threat to the OPT program. We don't have any real information about that. I can tell you that there have been other challenges to OPT, and as you know, OPT is still a program that's very much functioning. So as to future proclamations and what that could look like, we really can't answer those questions at this point, but I can promise you that we're monitoring the situation very closely, and we'll certainly keep our FAQs up to date, and we'll let our students and scholars know what to expect that way, and also by email if necessary. If you don't know, on our website we do have FAQs regularly updated, so that's one good source of information. I think I'm going to just start by saying, in general, and this is to address one of the questions that came in, I think we would recommend starting on OPT, because you want to maximize your options and the time that you have to work. So even if you are eligible, or if the university, for example, has committed to sponsoring you for H-1B, it's a good idea to start on OPT, especially for those of you who are in STEM fields, who then have not just 12 months, but 36 months of work authorization. And it's a relatively painless process. One update that I can tell you is that this year, contrary to our expectations, the EADs are being processed very quickly, maybe 1 to 2 months on average, whereas last year it was taking 3 to 5 months for those to process. I don't know why that's the case, but that is. Field offices are closed, but the processing centers are still cranking out those EAD cards. Let me see, is there anything else I wanted to say? Just a couple other OPT related updates. One of the accommodations that immigration has made for the current health crisis is that you are considered employed. It used to be that you had to be working at least 20 hours a week to be considered employed, and that is to stop the unemployment clock. And currently, you could be working 1 hour a week, and that would be enough to stop the unemployment clock. Remote employment counts towards stopping the unemployment clock as well. Another update, I know that some people have been wondering if OPT can be filed, if you can file for OPT outside of the US. That has been brought forward as a real issue, and to date, you still need to be in the US or you still need to file for OPT within the US. Let's see.
Adrienne, it'll be helpful if you could just like verbalize the question a little bit and, you know, give any context related to the questions for some of them.
Okay. All right. Is there anything in particular that was unclear?
No, I'm just, because this is a mixed crowd of people, like, you know, PhD students, postdocs, and faculty members. And so, you know, just some people might not really know about OPT.
Okay. So just to go back a few steps, OPT is available to F1 students, and it's taken typically right after you graduate. And it's 12 months of work authorization. And the employer, first of all, you can apply for it with or without employment, without a job offer. And you should apply for it as soon as possible. The earliest you could apply for it would be 90 days before the end date printed on your I-20. The latest you could apply for it would be 60 days after the end date, but we always advise you to apply as early as possible. So this would give you 12 months of work authorization. You would receive, if you apply for it, you would receive, hopefully, your EAD card, which would have the dates that you're eligible to work printed on it at the 12 months that you're eligible to work. From that start date that's printed on the EAD card, you're allowed to be unemployed for up to 90 days. So a typical strategy, especially for students who are looking into jobs in academia, a typical strategy would be to pick the latest start date possible, which if you were graduating in May, like this year, if you were graduating in May, the latest start date possible would have been July 16th. So even though most academic jobs start in August, you wouldn't be getting too many days of unemployment. The STEM OPT for STEM eligible students, you can apply for as early as 90 days before the end date of your first OPT. So it's not, a lot of times people think you apply for it all at the beginning, but unfortunately you have to apply for it again if you're eligible for the STEM OPT. Generally speaking, let's see, the job that you do must be directly relevant to your major. So is that enough of a general introduction? Okay, I think I'm going to move to Linda. Do you want to talk about the J as an option?
Sure. Okay. So J is very common as a visa type for postgraduate research associates or postdoctoral research positions. It's also very common for some lecturer or adjunct positions. So it's certainly an option that you can consider if you are looking at those types of positions after you graduate. I know there are some of you in this workshop that are already on J, and I want to talk about some misconceptions about the J also. But one thing you should note, you may have an option between J or H-1B, and Tim will talk more about H-1B. You may not have an option. Both of those visa types are sponsored by the institution. So it's really their decision whether or not to sponsor you for J or H-1B. Many institutions prefer to start you off on a J because it's cheaper. They don't have to pay the costs associated with the application. The J is basically very inexpensive to no cost for the department. It is also a training visa. It's for education, training, teaching, those kinds of activities. And the activity is what controls the visa status rather than the fact that you're employed or unemployed. So it makes it a little bit more flexible for people to be on a J than on an H-1B. There are a lot of misconceptions about hurdles associated with the J. There are some hurdles indeed, but not for everyone. The J has sometimes what is called, sometimes attached, I'm sorry. It's called the 2-year home residency requirement. That requirement is not attached to everyone. It is only attached to your program under certain circumstances, one being the source of the funding for your program. If your funding is coming from the institution that is hiring you, that's typically not government funding. And the 2-year rule would not be attached to your program based on that. The other consideration might be your nationality. Certain countries do have that requirement attached. Pretty much all of our students and scholars that are Chinese nationals do have it attached. And what it means on a practical level is that once you finish your J, you would have to return home for 2 years before you can be eligible for an H-1B or permanent residency. So really you just want to look at your career goals and your plans for the future and consider whether that's going to be a problem for you. If you think it might be, you might want to request an H-1B. We typically think, as Adrian said, it's best to maximize your options. So J1 gives you 5 years of eligibility to stay in the United States under that status. If you want to continue to stay, you can transition to H-1B, and that's another 6 years under H-1B. And from there, from that pathway, people typically apply for permanent residency if that's their career goal. So it does give you more time to make your decisions about options for your future if you go that direction. The 2-year rule doesn't impact any other action. So you can extend your program, you can switch back to an F if you want to go back to another program of studies, you can come back on a tourist visa. None of those things have an impact from the 2-year home residency rule. And it is possible to apply for a waiver to the rule. A lot of people do it. It's a fairly straightforward process. It is somewhat time consuming. So those are some of the issues. The benefit of the J1 is if you have a spouse and your spouse wants to work, your spouse can apply for employment authorization.
That's not an option with an F2 for an
It's
F.
not an option with an F, and it is not an option with H-1B. The dependent visa does not allow for employment authorization. So if that's a consideration, the J might be your preferred choice. A couple of questions that came up in the pre-questionnaire that went out. There were, let's see, I can find it here. So someone asked a question who is a Fulbright scholar. I don't know if you are in this meeting, but if you did ask this question about the 2-year residency home requirement as pertains to Fulbright, I would ask you to contact me directly about that. It's pretty specific to not very many people. Somebody else asked about the options for getting an exemption on the 2-year home rule. The most typical option is the no objection waiver. There are various options for requesting a waiver. The most common is based on no objection, which means that your country doesn't object to you applying for the waiver and our country doesn't object to you applying for the waiver. That is the most common, pretty much the easiest to obtain. The others are much more difficult and require a lot more evidentiary documentation. One example would be if you are working for an interested federal government agency. Another would be persecution, or financial hardship is a third one. But again, those we would advise you to talk to a qualified immigration attorney before pursuing those options. So the no objection is really the most common and the easiest to obtain. I think that was all I saw on the specific J1 questions from the pre.
Can I ask quickly, like for getting the objection, no objection certificate for J1, is it like, is it a matter of period, like on which year you can apply, or at which age, which state you should apply, like in 3rd year or 4th year, or is it like?
So the issue with applying for the waiver is that once you have applied, we cannot extend your J1 visa any further. So we typically recommend that you see if your department is willing to extend you as far as you can go and apply then. It can take a while to get the no objection letter from your home country government, depending on where you're from. Some countries it's easier to get than others. If you're, for example, an Indian national, that can take about a year. So you want to start well in advance. Other countries, it's pretty quick and easy. It can take maybe 2 to 3 months, but the typical processing time tends to be around 6 months. I don't know, Tim, if you've seen any differences at all, or if you would know, but that's
what I'm seeing currently.
what we hear, yeah.
So like if you apply in your 4th year and you get a basically waiver by the end of 5th, so
Yep.
like before your 5th, so can then university just give you a H1B if they are willing to give? Or?
Well, you still have to apply for it, but in order to apply for it, you have to have that waiver as part of your application.
Yeah, but it's like it won't take that much time, and you can go back. You have to go back to India to get H1B, or you can have it directly.
No, and Tim can address that when he talks about H1B.
Linda, have you finished what you wanted to say about
Yeah.
this? Okay, so let's move to Tim, and then we'll try and get to other questions.
Sure. Thanks, everybody. Nice to see you all this afternoon, or some of you, I guess, at least your names. So I'm Tim White. I am within Immigration Services, within Human Resources. And so I'll talk a little bit about academic-based H-1Bs. And as you might be aware, just to make the distinction quickly, there are both academic-based H-1Bs, and then there are H-1Bs for the private sector, right? So we're going to talk about academic-based H-1Bs, the primary distinction of which is that the H-1B category for people that are employed in higher educational institutions, it is available through the entirety of the year, and there is no upper limit of H-1Bs available, so we can always apply for one, assuming that you're eligible, okay? The private sector, as you might know, is quite different than that, okay? So that's one significant advantage to an H-1B at a higher ed institution. Now, sponsorship of an H-1B at a higher ed institution, or specifically UVA, starts within your department. They have to be willing to sponsor you. This is an employer-sponsored category. And the fees that are associated with the H-1B process, including processing fees and filing fees, are the responsibility of the employer. So when Linda mentioned costs in comparison to the J-1, costs are quite a bit more to apply for an H-1B, but they are the responsibility of the department. So perhaps that's good news for you as you're thinking about how to proceed. It is quite common for individuals to move from either J1 status or F1 or F1 OPT to an H-1B. That's what's known as a change of status H-1B petition, meaning you're moving from one valid visa category in the United States to another while remaining in the United States. And you do not, to address the question that came up earlier, there is no need for you to depart the US to achieve H-1B status. Now, one quick clarification around the H-1B and frankly, visa terminology in general. H-1B status means you have been approved for the particular category. At that stage, you do not have an entry visa in your passport, okay? So while it allows you to remain in the United States and be work authorized, if you were to depart the United States, which I realize right now is a little bit of a challenge, you would still need to visit a US embassy to apply for an H-1B entry visa to return to the United States, okay? So in essence, it's another screening process that takes place even after you're initially awarded the H-1B status through USCIS, okay? Now, in terms of some of the questions, or a little bit more general information about the H-1B, it is available to you for a total of 6 years. There are some exceptions to that if you achieve a certain stage of processing within the permanent residency application process. And then the other part of the H-1B is that it is what is known as a specialty occupation visa category, which means that the degree that you earned needs to be related to the position that you're going to occupy at the university. And it needs to involve some level of specialized knowledge. So for people that have earned PhDs, that's usually not an issue. We do encounter some difficulty with individuals that are moving into sort of roles that involve terminology like coordinator or manager, things that are more general knowledge based, okay? And then the other piece of the puzzle for the H-1B is that there is a requirement that a prevailing wage be met for the type of job that you're taking in this given geographic area, meaning Charlottesville or Albemarle County. I'll say in advance, in most cases, the salaries that are offered by UVA are above what the prevailing wage requirement is for the H-1B category. But just to be aware that there are certain steps and, in a sense, requirements that need to be satisfied before you can apply for and hopefully receive an H-1B. On to some of the questions that were received. H-1B costs I talked about already. They are the responsibility of the employer. The foreign national that's applying cannot share in those costs. There cannot be reimbursement, nor can the costs be deferred, was a question that was received. There was a question about whether to choose between H-1B or EB-1. And just to clarify, EB-1 is a permanent residency category, so a green card category. The answer to that question is it's not really an either or, it's more of a both. So H-1B is what is known as a dual intent visa category, meaning that you can both be here as a temporary employee, making use of your H-1B status, and you can also appropriately begin and complete the process of applying for permanent residency. Okay, so you should not be applying for permanent residency out of other categories. It's not to say that you can't, but we would like to see you, if you're at UVA, in H-1B before you start applying for permanent residency. Okay.
Is there a certain amount of time that UVA would want you to be H-1B before they would?
Good question. So there is no requirement. In a sense, I mentioned before that is up to your individual department to sponsor you for an H-1B. It's also up to your individual department as to whether they are willing to sponsor you for permanent residency. And UVA, and this will vary by institution, but UVA doesn't have a requirement that you serve in the role for a particular period of time. The one thing that I will mention, because we're dealing with on this call with a fair number of postdocs, is that the role does need to be considered to be permanent before you can apply for employer-sponsored permanent residency. So postdoc roles, by their nature, are not permanent, right? You can't stay in that role forever. A research scientist role or another role at the university, even if it is renewable annually, every year, those are considered to be permanent positions. You would still need to work with your department to get their willingness to sponsor, but at least the type of role that you have is not a barrier, okay? So there's a variety of employer-sponsored permanent residency categories. The goal at the university, in tandem with your H-1B status, is that we get you to the point where you have been approved for the permanent residency category that you applied within. And the reason for that is fairly straightforward. Once you're approved for that category, we then can set aside the 6-year limit or maximum of H-1B status and actually extend your H-1B beyond those 6 years if we have a need to do so. Okay, so our goal is always to get you approved for the particular category of green card that you applied within. And I won't go too much further into that, but that's how those two processes sort of align. You remain in H-1B status until you actually have your green card in hand.
How much does the H-1B actually cost?
So H-1B costs, the filing fees, again, dependent on the circumstances. With USCIS, current filing fee is $460. If it is a new H-1B, in this case meaning new to the university, there's also an anti-fraud fee that's required of $500. And then happily, as of this past Friday, USCIS reinstated our ability to premium process H-1Bs at an additional cost of $1,440. Okay, so two other notes. There's a processing fee within my office of $1,000, so add that in. And then further, what was I going to say? Sorry, I've lost what the other fees are. If that's not expensive enough.
Is it always, so you said that the department is responsible for those fees at UVA. At other institutions, is it possible that the institution as a whole covers those costs, or is it almost always?
Oh, I see. Good question. It is the employer responsibility. At UVA, it tends to be the department. in some cases, in arts and sciences, it seems that they usually go with those costs to the dean's office,
Okay.
and the dean's office has a pool. So it really depends, but the unit is ultimately responsible for figuring out how it's going to be paid for.
Tim, I feel like I always ask you this question when you get to the single versus dual intent, because it comes up multiple times in my conversations. Can postdocs or research scientists transition from a J1 to a permanent residency category, or should they go through the H1B process first?
So there's a can they versus in my opinion, a should they, right? So Linda already mentioned the 2-year home residency requirement, which can be a barrier to both moving to H1B and also to permanent residency. So there's that to consider. The other thing to think about is, so I mentioned that the H1B is a dual intent visa. Other visa categories are what is known as single intent. So you come to the United States and you are allowed to undertake the activities that are permitted within your visa category. So we do have individuals that will apply out of F and J status for permanent residency, whether it be employer sponsored or perhaps working with an outside immigration attorney and filing not based on employment, but rather on their individual credentials. The challenge with that is that once they apply in those categories, they have violated the intent of their visa status, which, if you really recall, was single intent. And the challenge there is that while the processing of the permanent residency case, in my opinion, oddly, can go forward, they don't want to put themselves in a position where their whole entire immigration situation is reviewed, because you could be viewed as to have violated your status. So let me give you a for instance. If you're in F or J status and have applied for permanent residency and you depart the United States and return to the US using your F or J status, and you arrive at the border, Customs and Border Protection is very likely to review your circumstances and see that you have indeed applied for permanent residency, and that is a violation of your F or J status. And it's quite possible that they could say to you, I'm sorry, you violated your status. We're not going to allow you to return to the United States. And so you're turned back at the border and sent back home. Okay, so H-1B, in contrast, I mentioned before, is a dual intent visa status. So if you depart the United States and return, and they see that you are in H-1B status and have applied or have an ongoing application for permanent residency, it's not a problem. You're able to be admitted to the United States and return to your current employment arrangement and continue with processing of your green card. Okay.
There were a number of questions about travel and visas, which we should probably address. At this point, embassies and consulates are not processing routine visas. We don't know when that will resume. We've had reports of students being able to get a visa appointment and then it getting canceled and rescheduled. It's unclear at this point how that's gonna play out. And there are currently, travel is banned from, let's see, and this is from the CDC website, which I think is pretty up to date. But it says foreign nationals who've been in any of the following countries during the past 14 days may not enter the US. That's China, Iran, the European Schengen area, UK, Republic of Ireland, and Brazil. Is there anything else we need to discuss about? Remember also that the visa itself and the passport is a travel document only. So if you're in the US, it can be expired as long as your other documents are still valid, with no consequence to your legal status or presence in the US. but the visa does have to be renewed outside of the US. Unlike the passport, which can be renewed within the US, you have to be outside of the US in order to renew the visa. But it can be expired if you're here. Let's see. So
does that affect the filing? There's a question in the
so the applying for a new visa. Yeah. So first of all, you can't do it. First of all, you can't. They're not doing it. They're not processing routine visas. So it's just not happening right
So
now.
in particular, entry visas is what we're talking about, right? At US embassies.
Yes.
So status, just to clarify, is ongoing within the United States. We're able to apply for H-1Bs as usual, without limitation, and it's the same for Fs and Js. Is that correct?
So if you're in the US and you have, your I-20 or DS 2019 or whatever, you're okay. But if I don't know what's going to happen to the initial status students, for example. I don't know if they're going to be able to get in, because we just don't know when they're going to resume processing, entry visas. So it's a big unknown.
So our advice generally for people that are here in the US, for those of you that are here, if you don't have to travel, don't.
Yeah.
If you do have to travel and will need to renew your visa in order to return, plan for that to take a while, because we just have no way of knowing when things will reopen.
And you've probably been hearing a lot about the proclamation from the White House regarding China in particular. And there's not a whole lot we can say about that either, but probably it's going to mean a lot of delays in processing when they do start processing visas. Probably many more cases of administrative processing.
And I think one point of confusion about the proclamation that I've heard from a number of people is what exactly it means. And at this point, it's really just for those people that are outside the US and need to apply for a visa in order to come here. So they're targeting very specific fields of study and research. Their State Department is claiming it's a very small percentage that may be impacted. If you are here and you're Chinese, not much is going to happen to you at this point that we've heard anything about. Your visa won't be revoked. In the future, they may look at that. That's an open question, but currently the information that we have is really just targeting new visa applications for graduate students in certain fields and researchers in certain fields. And those fields tend to be focused on areas that are of national security interest to the US. So I hope that is as clear as mud.
That's about how clear it is to all of us.
Right?
Do you want to just take a quick glance over those travel and visa questions and see if there's anything else that needs to be addressed? Let's see.
So I just highlighted a couple. I think the pertinent ones are the postdocs who might face pay cuts or like staff members face hurdles. And I forget what the next one was in that. Yeah, so that's definitely a important one. And the remote work situation, those are like couple things that I think you should address.
So for if you're taking advantage of the OPT option, you can work remotely. I don't know if anybody had a chance to look at the, there was another webinar with Mark Rhodes and Richard Tansen earlier. Mark Rhodes' opinion is that if you're furloughed, you are unemployed. But if you can work 1 hour a week, you are employed. Do you have, can you address that, Linda and Tim, for J?
Yeah, from the perspective of the J visa, because the J is governed by the activity, the primary activity has to be ongoing, which means if you're furloughed and you're unemployed, you're no longer engaged in your research, and that would end your J program. It does give the option, though, for people to reduce their hours. Your primary activity is still going to be your research. It's just a reduced number of hours. So the J1 can stay active under that circumstance.
And remote employment.
Remote is also fine because you're still engaged in your research. We just need to add that location as a site of activity. So rather than working at UVA, you're working from your home, just to make a note of that.
So for H-1Bs, this is quite complicated. So I'll take a few minutes. Easier of the two questions is about working remotely. So if you happen to be working from home in H-1B status, with H-1Bs, we are required to identify your work site, meaning where you work on grounds. And there's a 30-day clause which allows you to work elsewhere, but once you exceed 30 days, we need to identify your other work locations as a work site. So for individuals around grounds currently on H-1Bs, we've just gone through a process of having them actually post their positions in their homes to identify their homes as an actual work site. I see some smiles from people that have just done that. So that's one portion of that. In regard to furloughs, it is quite a complex situation in regard to H-1Bs. So H-1Bs, we identify the terms and conditions of your employment within the petition that we file. And included in that is something called a labor condition attestation. And that labor condition document is essentially a guarantee by the employer, in this case UVA, about the wage rate that will be paid, salary, and that you receive full-time benefits if that's your situation, and also the wage level that we need to at least meet or exceed for your position. So that is in effect for the entirety of your H-1B time period, the validity period. And the employer, in a sense, guarantees that that is your employment circumstance, okay? So when we talk about what's happening at the university currently, a full furlough, for example, where it's interpreted as an individual being sent home for a number of months, for example, and not being paid by that time, during that time period, that is not possible with an H-1B status. If I had to advise a department, I would have to tell them that you would have to terminate that individual because you're violating that agreement that was part of the original H-1B petition, okay? So the employment would have to end. The individual could be rehired later if they were still in the United States, but it would be an entirely new H-1B petition, okay? So that's a full furlough is quite complicated. If it was a partial furlough, which can really take two forms, one is a reduction in your salary. The second would be a reduction in the number of hours that you work. Both of those would very likely trigger the need to file what we would call an H-1B amendment, where we would send a petition to USCIS, and it's an entirely new H-1B petition with all of those fees that I mentioned previously in play. And we would send it into USCIS to tell them that your situation of employment had changed, whether it was the reduction in hours or a reduction in your salary. And prior to doing that filing, we would have to take a look at what the reduction in your salary, for example, looks like in regard to the prevailing wage that's required for your H-1B. And so we could run into some difficulties there. So I won't go too much further than that, but it's quite a different circumstance for individuals in H-1B status during this time and what we're experiencing at UVA and with other employers.
Tim, there are a couple questions for you in the Google Doc. One is when's a good time to start the H-1B renewal process? In other words, how long does it take?
So you're able to apply for an H-1B extension, a maximum of 6 months in advance of the expiration date of the current H-1B. And with all things immigration, we recommend doing it as early as possible.
Okay, so, and I think this question is related. So I think you may have addressed this already, but how long does it take for UVA to apply and obtain an academic H-1B visa for students transitioning from F1 to postdoc?
Right. So just for everybody's information, I did put this in the chat, but for the time that I receive the materials, so I'll put that caveat in there. You've got to prep the materials along with your department and get them submitted to me. Currently, USCIS has posted processing times of 2 to 4 months. And that seems to be holding true for the most part for a regular processing H-1B case. I mentioned previously that premium processing is again available for an additional cost of $1,440. So it's not inexpensive. But if we went the premium processing route, the processing in its entirety would take something just less than a month.
Do you pretty much always do premium processing if that option is available to you?
We do. Of course, it's dependent on the department having the resources to do that. For new H-1Bs, it's, as people are aware, it's very unlikely that we would have in excess of 4 months from a hire date to take a filing action, right? So in some ways, the hiring timeline defines what path we need to take with the H-1Bs. It is usually the case with new H-1Bs that we would file at premium processing. And then in other circumstances, folks would prefer certainty versus uncertainty, meaning a decided petition versus a undecided petition, particularly in sort of uncertain immigration atmosphere that we're within currently. So departments seem to be willing to accommodate that by paying for premium processing.
Okay. How about this? I'm here on a 3-year H-1B visa, but my contract of employment ends in October. What are my options? I guess this has been addressed somewhat and will probably be addressed in the next webinar. But
so if you're H-1B, I mean, I'm not sure what you mean by options, but if your first part of that is if your H-1B, if your employment ends with the University of Virginia and your H-1B period extends beyond that, we sponsored you for a longer period of time. The first part of it would be that UVA would withdraw sponsorship of your H-1B. We would notify USCIS that you're no longer employed at UVA, right? Which now there is an accommodation within that you are given, and this is a little bit complicated, so listen carefully. You are given either 60 days or to the end of your H-1B validity period, whichever comes first, during which you can remain in the United States and figure out what's next, whether that means packing up your stuff in preparation for leaving or finding another job at another organization that's willing to sponsor you, or perhaps even moving to a different visa category, whatever that possibility might look like.
Okay, in the chat, there's a question. If I have a 2-year home requirement, is it possible to change my visa status from J1 to H1B with waiver option?
Well, as Linda said, you'd have to apply for the waiver. and successfully navigate that process before we could submit for your H-1B petition.
Okay.
Linda, Adrian and Linda, there are a couple questions about teaching focused, universities or institutes and F1 OPT options for adjunct positions.
So the OPT is an option for adjunct teaching, as would be J1, right?
Absolutely.
And remote teaching would count. Does that address that question?
Yeah, there's another question which is like kind of specific. Let me go
Is it
there.
the one 20, if you're working at multiple employment, multiple places of employment?
20 hours.
That's probably going to be easier on OPT than on J1. Would that be true, do you think, Linda? Because so the question is, could you use your OPT to teach or do an adjunct role in a private institute? So
Sure.
20 hours for teaching
Well,
in one institute and another 20 hours for another employer or startup. So you can work for as many employers as you want under OPT.
not so for J1.
Yeah.
Again, it's J1 is sponsored by the institution, and you can't just work anywhere. you are somewhat restricted in terms of where you can earn money under a J1. It has to be through the sponsoring institution.
Or you would have to get permission, right? Or like written permission.
Yeah, that gets complicated. So.
But for OPT, you could certainly work for multiple places. Let's see. There was a general opinion question, pre-submitted question about how the COVID-19 situation will affect the job market. And you know what, the job market, it's going to be the same if you're, everybody's affected by that, right? There's a hiring freeze at UVA. It's going to be a tough market.
Yeah.
It's going to be tough. Let's see.
There's a question for like an O1 and residency sort of. Under what circumstances would UVA sponsor and offer an EB1 or O1 visa? Tim, maybe you should handle that for someone who wants to transition from F1 or J1.
Instead of going to H-1B, going to an O1 or
EB1.
So
an O1 or an EB1, it's obviously it's a much higher standard than what an H-1B requires. So in O1, we typically see those awarded to individuals that are sort of mid-career. In many ways, the standard for the O1 and EB1 are similar in terms of demonstrating that you have an expertise in a certain area, and that is usually demonstrated through a record of publications, a record of membership in professional associations that is a demonstration of your expertise, a demonstration of citations to your work that you have published, and also the ability to get letters of support from individuals who will attest to your expertise. So it's possible to do, you just have to be able to meet the standards. And keep in mind that given those qualifications, at least from my own experience with both of these categories, it does take a fair amount of time to assemble that material, particularly the letters that you're depending on individuals to provide, to be able to pull together the materials in order to submit the application. So it's not necessarily something that can happen particularly quickly because you're depending on other folks and certainly the assistance of an attorney to help you pull together the case. So it can be definitely months of preparation time.
Yeah, and you mostly handle the process of the H-1B. There's a specific question about somebody's options for August 2020. If they were a postdoc, how fast should, is the process currently going for them to start the process? Or
Right. So I mentioned a little bit about timing before, 2 to 4 months, regular processing, premium processing is a month. But again, with all things immigration, if you know you're graduating or your postdoc position will end August 2020, you need to be looking at, are you able to continue your employment at UVA in some other role, perhaps a research scientist role, in which case we could also look at the H-1B for sponsorship. Or are there other employers out there where you're going to find an opportunity and they're going to need a little bit of time to be able to submit a new H-1B application for you and get that in place. So when you do a change of status, meaning moving from one valid visa category to another, in this case H-1B, it does need to be approved before you can begin employment. So there's no opportunity to work while the petition is pending.
And remember that the OPT is always an option. If you're graduating this August, you can apply now for OPT and start on the OPT.
Yeah, on a related, there's like one question specifically on how early can you apply for the STEM extension while you're on.
Yeah, I did answer that question. That would be 90 days before the expiration of the initial OPT.
Wow, we did amazing. We figured out most of the questions. The last one is a quick answer for Tim. If someone wants to switch from a CAP exempt to a CAP or a H-1B for private sector, is there a way to do it without going through the CAP lottery?
Oh, you say it's a quick answer. So there's a very narrow possibility, and it's not one that is easily accommodated. And that is that if you are employed at UVA, for example, in a CAP exempt position, and you have an offer also from a CAP subject entity, a concurrent H-1B application can be filed outside of the lottery. And you can be approved for working for that CAP subject entity with an H-1B. The difficulty comes in that you can't then, this isn't an opportunity for some kind of sneaky backdoor ability to get to a CAP subject H-1B. You have to maintain your employment with the CAP exempt employer. So really you would need a part-time job with the UVA or a CAP exempt employer, and also a part-time job at a for-profit entity in order to keep that for-profit H-1B available and active. So you need both jobs to be in existence.
That was way too much information for 5 o'clock in the evening. My head is swimming, and I consider myself more or less fluent in this language. But, so I think we've handled most of the questions, right?
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to impose you to stay beyond 5. And so, if anybody else has any questions, we would handle them for next session, or just send them to us and we'll forward it to Tim, Adrienne, or Linda, and they can get back to us. How do you feel about that?
Sounds good to
Absolutely. Yeah, happy to help everybody.
All right, it looks like we're getting all the thank yous, so feels like people are pretty much satisfied with the 1 hour that they send. I'll take the 3 thank yous, or 5, 6, 7. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. Good to see everybody.
Today with us.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.